That's right. The National Science Foundation doesn't fund it, etc. The NIH doesn't fund it. Again, because you have a kind of groupthink, which is a popular word for what sociologists would describe as a shared ideological view or a worldview and so forth. And look, then you get the way it's crossed over at Davos. Bill Gates goes to Davos because he's the world's richest man, or now maybe a second richest man, boo-hoo-hoo. But does he know anything about any of these issues? Of course not. He knows nothing about Africa. He doesn't know nothing about agriculture. He doesn't know anything, okay? But he's invited and his butt is kissed, to be perfectly honest, because of his wealth and power. It's all about power, deferential attitudes towards power, rather than some kind of rational approach to, wow, let's investigate this problem. Let's try to remove it from these ideological straitjackets and actually investigate this problem. That's what I say, that another world, one would like to believe that Putzai's work would funding to try to replicate it or tweak it or something would be funded by the government at a different lab in the UK and see if it was supported, see if it came up with the same kind of results or with different kind of results, etc. That's the way science advances and is supposed to advance, not by silencing people who find discordant truths. But by the way, I mean, there was a book put out 30 years ago called The Structure of Scientific Revolutions by Kuhn, K-U-H-N, which laid this all out, that science does not evolve slowly. It actually is discontinuous within different, what he called paradigms, okay? So we have a very dominant paradigm now about genetics and genetic engineering, and it's very, very hard to break out of that. It's like, the Ptolemaic universe and the Copernican universe, It didn't just happen easily to change that frame of reference from an Earth-centered universe to a Sun-centered universe.
Well, I kind of like using Arthur Schopenhauer, who's a German philosopher from about 200 years ago, when he expressed his views on truth, which he held to be universally applicable, which is that all truth goes through three stages. First, it's ridiculed, then it's violently opposed, and then it's finally accepted as self-evident. So I guess the challenge is to accelerate the process through these three stages so that we can get true information that's truly going to serve the masses.
Well, yeah, in Kuhn's terms, you have to, these anomalies, in other words, things that don't fit, have to continually accumulate until finally the paradigm will shift. But what happens in the interim, of course, is that a lot of people are hurt. A lot of people's professions can be ruined. A lot of people can starve. You know what I mean? It's not like there aren't social costs, real costs to real people of these kinds of intellectual issues.
So do you have any recommendations or efforts or suggestions as to how to change that or catalyze that process?
Well, I'd like to think that the sorts of stuff that I and others are doing, raising consciousness about these issues, I happen to believe in democracy, and the more people who are aware of these things and begin to question them, question centers of power, about their abuse of power and so forth, the more likely it is that social change will come about.
So what started your interest in this area? How'd you get involved in it?
My father read to me from the Bible when I was a kid, and when we were reading about the prophets, I said to him, "Do you mean that this guy stood up in front of the king and said to the king, 'You're wrong and you shouldn't be doing what you're doing'?" And my father said, "That's what the story says." And the lesson I seem to have taken from that is, unfortunately, not one that a lot of people take from it, which is that it's good and wholesome and proper to question power, what the Quakers call speaking truth to power. Most people, yes, I had certain advantages. I had the privilege of having a tenured position at a university They tried to get rid of me in 100 different ways, but I was able to hold on. And most people don't have that kind of protection. I'm not being naive when I say that not enough people speak truth to power. But the first thing is for people to know what the truth is. So by doing things like this interview with you, I hope that more people will look at this question in a different kind of way and continue to educate themselves and then speak out about it. That's largely why genetically engineered foods and stuff are not prevalent in Europe compared to here. It's because there's much more awareness among the population, because there have been debates since the early days having to do with the introduction of legislation, having to do with a different electoral system, proportional representation, so that green parties were able to get into national parliaments even with small, 5% of the vote, whereas here it's winner take all in the district. So minority views rarely, if ever, get into the legislature. And the issues were debated and became part of public discourse in Europe and became much more prominent in people's minds, and their worldviews changed. And ironically, the precautionary principle, which I talked about before, was an American invention in the early part of the 20th century and was codified in most of our regulatory stuff, like the Food and Drug Acts of the 1930s, that put the burden of proof on the developer and said you have to show that it's safe. Not that we have to show that it's dangerous, you have to show that it's safe. The problem is, because of the economic imbalance, beginning with the Reagan Revolution and the change in regulation, we now don't, that has all been cast aside in the U.S., as if we have to show that the regulators or the consumers have to show that something's dangerous, which is ridiculous. Europe didn't used to have the precautionary principle, and that's why they had so many thalidomide babies, for example, because they did not have that built into their food and drug laws, where thalidomide was stopped here by a woman in the FDA who saw that, got the file, the dossier, and looked at it and said, they've got to show us what effects this has. And by the time that research was being conducted and they demanded it, all of these thalidomide babies were being born without limbs or with atrophied limbs in Europe, and they realized what the problem was. So we, who, in terms of public policy, developed and applied the precautionary principle, have now abandoned it largely, and the Europeans, after a great deal of heartache, have adopted it. And the struggles in the biosafety protocol and in other arenas of public policy to maintain the rules of precaution that says the proponent of technological change should have the burden of proving that it's socially acceptable, and so forth and so on. That's really a major kind of the struggle. So here's again the ideology. Do most people think that the developers at Monsanto should have to publicly and in a transparent manner disclose all of this stuff, investigate all of these potential concerns and so forth? Most people don't. They don't think about this. It doesn't occur to them, and they just say, the government says it's okay, so it must be okay.
And it's largely related on the previous accomplishments of the FDA, and especially the one you referenced with the thalidomide issue, which was probably one of their crowning glories. I mean,
I would think,
I can't think of any better action they had, and it seems like it was all downhill after there. And what is your belief that led to the downfall of the FDA after that time?
Well, I indicated this. I mean, the actual, quote, Reagan Revolution, actually deregulation began under Carter. I know the guy, I was at Cornell at the time, who Carter appointed from the Cornell faculty to deregulate the airline industry. But that was just the nose of the camel inside the tent, and of course under Reagan and subsequent administrations, Bush and Clinton and Bush too, and even under Obama, to some extent under Obama, there's a push to deregulate, smaller government, less government and everything. And that led from the thalidomide situation at FDA to the one that I announced, the substantial equivalent one. So in 1992, without any scientific basis, adequate scientific basis at all, the FDA adopted the policy that genetically engineered foods are substantially the same as non-engineered foods. That is the total reverse of the precautionary principle, and it had to do because of power, economic and political power that had shifted. That instead of having a strong union movement and consumer movements and so forth, we had strong corporations who were getting every day more and more power, like they just did a year ago with the Citizens United decision of the Supreme Court. So now they can officially, during elections, propagandize us even more than they do.
I'd like to go back to the differences between the United States and Europe, because I think
Sure.
it serves a really powerful example and motivating principle that we can make a difference. But I want to also be realistic in the process too, and I hadn't realized that part of the reason they may have been successful was the political structure, which, unlike the U.S. and your reference, is really it's winner take all. It's either it's all or none sort of system. Whereas in Europe, they have the potential to get these minority parties in and then really influence a discussion and change the consciousness. So do you think that that's an insurmountable barrier from your expertise in public policy? Or I mean, how do we make this transition to improve the consciousness and increase the discussion in the public realm?
I think that is a major issue, and it's not only, by the way, in terms of food, in terms of GMOs, it has to do with public policy issues of all types. The political system in the U.S., and by the way, this is consciously done as the two major parties began to become more powerful. They systematically froze out and were successful at freezing out other representation. I mean, there are lots of examples of places that had this form of proportional representation where the dominant parties got legislation changed to eliminate it, to consolidate their power position and so forth. There are other differences between Europe and the U.S., but which I can mention. Twice as many people, it's about 2% of the population is involved in farming, as opposed to 1% here. Family farms and small farms are much more the norm in Europe, whereas here we have these huge industrial farms. Farms in Europe are much closer to.
Why do you think that is? Because they would see we have a lot more land mass here, and the potential for farms are certainly far higher than in Europe, but yet they have more farmers than we do and more